Hi, welcome to our July bonus Liberal Values Lab with my friend, former colleague, geopolitical expert, best-selling author. Your latest book is The End is Just the Beginning, Peter Zeihan. There you go. Run out and get it. So for those of you who are joining us, not part of the Circle community, obviously you can see everything that's going on, but you won't be able to type in any questions. So we invite you to join. Promise it's nothing spammy. It's just our community where you can be part of the conversation. This will also be on YouTube within the next 48 hours. So we join you to subscribe to our YouTube page as well. So with that, I'm going to keep this to our hour because I know some of you might be waiting to see Donald Trump speak at the RNC right after this. So this is a good opportunity for Peter to talk to us about America's political transition, looking at it in a new and a novel way, and perhaps even answering some questions on how we may navigate what some people are calling this like turmoil. So Peter, with no further ado, I hand the mic to you.
All right, I'm going to wax philosophic here for about 15 minutes, and then everybody can break out their knives and go to it. It's the key thing to remember about the American political system is that it's a first past the post single member district network, which is a funny political science legalese way of saying that you vote for a specific person who would then represent a specific group of people in a specific geography. You don't vote for a party, you vote for a guy or a gal. And because of this system, we tend to get two very, very large coalitions of groups who represent two big tent groups. Because the idea is if you can get one more vote than whoever comes in second, then you're going to win the seat. And so if you had like 9 parties, you could do that with just 15% of the vote. But by combining these coalitions into larger and larger and bigger tents, you force that number up and you make it more likely that you're going to defeat whoever is waiting in the wings. That's one of the reasons why we almost never have a third party that is serious, because you're then splitting the vote 3 ways, and whoever's the biggest coalition tends to win regardless of what the policy happens to be. So in this system, we have traditionally, for the last, let's call it 60 years, have had these coalitions of coalitions. Now, for those of you who can remember back to the dark days of when Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, you will remember that this is not how things went down. Just running down the line here, Black Americans saw Hillary Clinton as a white chick who had already lived in the White House and she didn't need to be there again. The socialists had a real problem with her because she was seen as a representative of Wall Street. Same with the under 30s who saw her as too old. The Greens and unions got into a fight over what a good economic policy would be. Unmarried women liked her aside from the fact that she was married. On the Republican side, the business community looked at Trump and they saw not a business person, but a marketer, and not a very good one at that. The national security folks actually thought that Hillary Clinton had more experience in that field than anything that Donald Trump had. The evangelicals, like, okay, Trump has not just had 1 affair or 2 affairs or 3 affairs, but 13 documented affairs, including one with a porn star. And we saw a split in that community between the younger ones who tried to use ethics as a guide for their voting, who didn't really care for him, and the older ones who were willing to sublimate that for political power. Pro-lifers, the pro-choicers weren't sure where to stand because Donald Trump kept changing his position. And the fiscal conservatives, again, saw Hillary Clinton as actually more conservative on most issues than Donald Trump. And then the Catholics in the middle just wanted to take a shower. And by the time all was said and done and the dust settled on election day, this is how things actually broke down. Now, this is normal. Not the breakdown, but the concept of the breakdown. Because every generation or two, when you have 2 big tents, things have changed. The world has changed. We've changed. Demographics have changed. Economic patterns have changed. Employment patterns have changed. And every time that happens, the factions that make up the parties move around. They rise and fall in power within their own big tents, and sometimes factions jump into the swing category, or maybe even switch sides completely. The last time we went through one of these reshufflings for real, the really big one, was in the Great Depression. And then Big business were all Democrats, and African Americans were all Republicans, and they switched side into a new format that held for several decades. We're in the midst of this process right now. This is not the second time we've done it. This is not the third time we've done it. This is the sixth time we've done it. And when we emerge from this on the other side, we will be entering what will be called the seventh party structure. But we're not there yet. These transition periods take anywhere from 4 to 12 years. We're in year 6 to 7 right now. We probably have one more political cycle to go through before this all settles. But in the meantime, it means that what we think of as Democrats and Republicans have already irreversibly changed. They just haven't settled on what their new form is going to be, which means it's a little bit easier to wrap your mind around of this instead of looking at this Democrat versus Republican, but instead to look at it on a matrix. If you're at the top of this matrix, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're at the bottom, social conservative, you think the government should be involved in people's personal lives in order to protect certain social norms. If you're on the right, you want the government out of your wallet. And if you're on the left, you think the government should have its hand in people's wallets in order to remake society in some way. And you can combine these in any number of ways. So for example, if you're at the top left, a social liberal and an economic conservative, you really, truly, deeply approve all of the work that the bureaucrats in Washington do, and you want to throw a party to thank them where you will serve arsenic cake. And if you're at the top left, an economic and a social liberal, you look forward to the glorious day when we're all dancing around a campfire, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and wearing government-issued gunny sacks that were paid for by the confiscation of all private property. We are all on here somewhere, and this is where all of our political factions lie. Now again, the blue, that's what we have traditionally in the last few decades thought of the Democrats. The red is the Republican alliance, and the greens are our current traditional swing voters. Now, enter Trump. The single biggest impact that he has had is he's elevated one faction above all the others. And they came in from left field, right field, I guess it would be. The American populace have really sat out the last 6 presidential elections until Donald Trump came about. And so he was basically able to activate a group that was on the sidelines, had not been part of the process. And in doing so, he made this very powerful, very cohesive, very loyal voting bloc that I would argue today is the single most numerous voting bloc in the system. And under Trump's first term, they got a taste of power for the first time. And they liked it, and they are not going away. But in drawing this group into the system, he ended up picking fights with 4 factions that had until now kind of been considered the adults in the room of American politics. And he ended up campaigning against their candidates for Congress. He purged them from his administration. And as of March of this year, he purged all of their representatives from the Republican National Committee. And as we've seen in the last couple of days with the Republican National Convention, none of these people are represented. It is all folks from the populist wing. They, for all intents and purposes, are now swing voters. But Trump was also able to bait in other groups who were closer to his social conservative core supporters. This includes none other than a minority with the Hispanics and the unions, who have been a core part of the Democratic coalition really for the last 150 years. This today is the Trump Republican coalition. It is powerful, it is large, it is loyal, and it is not enough to win an election. Remember, big tents are how you win an election, and this group has a very real problem reaching out and forming alliances with other people. Now, there's any number of ways that we can go with this, but let me focus on 2. First of all, the unions in the business community, for the first time in American history, are not in one coalition or another. They have traditionally been the backbone of the two parties, typically on opposite sides, and their conversations, their debates, their compromises is what is responsible for economic policy in this country. And so if you look back to the Trump administration, or you look today at the Biden administration, and you're wondering what the hell is going on with economic policy, well, there isn't one because the people who can do math are not in the room. And that is going to be a problem until this all settles out, until one or two of these factions joins one or the other coalitions. Which ones will go which way? Way too soon to tell. They've basically been, especially the business community, ignored in this dust up. The other issue, from my point of view, which is just as important, if not more, is that the national security folks are not even in the room. And if you look at these two factions, business and national security, that has been the core of American foreign policy going back over a century. And again, they are no longer in the room. Now, this takes us any number of places too, but let me just kind of give you the short version. In times when the American political system is unsettled like it is today, it's hard to build a consensus on anything domestically, and we tend to ignore everything internationally. And if you look at the third to the fourth transition and the fourth to the fifth transition, the first one is late Reconstruction, the fourth to the fifth is in the Great Depression. The Americans basically didn't play a role in much of anything from a government point of view. And a lot of things went down in these periods. In late Reconstruction, we had the mass urbanization and the industrialization of Europe. We had European monarchies that were snapping like matchsticks and starting to form alliances with one another that would lead to the Great World Wars. We had the rise of Japan as a major power, and we saw independent business people in the United States basically go out and make foreign policy for themselves, a legacy that still poisons our relationship with Latin America to this day. As for the Great Depression, we all talk about how horrible it was here. Well, it was horrible everywhere. And this saw the rise of totalitarianism across Europe and Northeast Asia. This is the rise of Hitler. This is the Stalin consolidation in the Soviet Union. This is the Spanish and the Chinese Civil War. And this is Japan basically going bonsai in the entire Pacific. Now, I don't mean to suggest here that if the United States had had its domestic political ducks in order, that none of these things would have happened. What I'm trying to communicate is that because the United States ducks were scattered, we didn't even have the option of playing any role in any of these major changes to the global condition. And this time around, that's a really big fucking deal, because in the next 10 years, we're going to see the demographic dissolution of the Chinese system. We're probably going to see the end of the European Union. We're going to see a significant expansion of Russia's war in Ukraine to involve a number of nuclear powers. We're probably going to see a war in the Middle East that hits the energy sector. And of course, when China breaks, all hell's going to break loose in the Middle East. We are going to have famines on a continental scale in various parts of the Eastern Hemisphere, and we're also going to have global energy shortages. And the United States, if it can't get this stuff figured out real soon, is not going to be able to do much of anything about any of that. Now, I focus on the really, really big pictures. And while all of these things are crazy and substantial, the impact directly on the United States is somewhat limited. We're the world's largest food producer and exporter. We're the world's largest energy producer and processor, and now exporter of finished goods or finished refined product. And we're in the process of massively expanding our industrial plant to insulate ourselves from the Chinese. These are all good things. And they mean if the world breaks, we're in a pretty good spot. But if the world breaks, we will still feel a lot of it. And as long as we're dicking around with figuring out what the next political evolution is going to be, we won't have the bandwidth to focus on international affairs in a seriously meaningful way, no matter who wins the presidency. Okay. I think I did enough in that to piss off everyone. So let me pass this back to Jen and we'll go wherever you guys want to go.
Well, first, let me welcome one of our ILV advisors, Ken Pope, with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I'll open it up also to questions from the audience, but there's a couple of questions. I'll get us started and you can jump in as well. I was watching something the other day that really surprised me. You'd mentioned the unions and how they shifted. And the union boss came and spoke at the RNC. And that had a lot.
Teamsters boss of all of them. Like basically, if you want to put concrete shoes on someone, the Teamsters are the people you turn to. So, to have them show up at the RNC, I mean, if this had happened 8 years ago, the guy would have probably been arrested. But again, law and order is no longer part of the Republican platform.
But that the union is the one. I mean, I've got questions on the national security and business front too, but that was the one that I was not expecting. And can you speak a little bit more to that? I mean, the union, and one of the response, at least from what I read from the Democrat side, was just, basically, what the hell, right? Yeah. I mean, we've given you all that you've wanted. Why in the world would the union side for a party, if you will? And I know that the party doesn't look the same, but that is basically a union busting party. Is that changing too?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely changed. Union busting requires the business community to be being part of the coalition. It's not. So 3 things are in play at the moment. Number one, international affairs from an American point of view has been based on an alliance system for decades, also on international engagement and open trade of various forms. And, there's definitely differences administration to administration, party to party, but there's been a bipartisan consensus on that for decades. That consensus is arguably the single biggest detriment to the unions of the last 75 years. Because if you allow countries to compete on a level playing field, American workers will do very, very well. But if you provide a globalized structure where countries that normally couldn't be stable themselves are allowed to be stable because the United States destroys all of the threats and allows everyone to access everyone else's market, you're providing, from the union's point of view, an unfair advantage to the countries that are less stable by elevating them. And that has indirectly hurt the unions. Obviously, the rise of China is part of that conversation as well. So that's number one. They're a little cheesed off at the consensus. And Donald Trump has been the candidate who has more directly confronted that consensus. The second issue, unions may be economically liberal on the liberal versus conservative front, but they're socially conservative. So it wasn't really a big hop for them to make the shift, especially when Donald Trump does fight the culture war very, very competently. Now, me as a technocrat might find that awful, but I'm only one guy. And to be perfectly blunt, people who believe in my version of internationalism have lost the last 8 presidential elections. And this time we don't even have a guy in the race. So I guess that's 2 races in a row we haven't had a guy in the race because we've got 2 populists running. And then third, if I am right about the Chinese and their depopulation is really as bad as it looks, and the new data from just this week suggests that they lost another 8 million children under age 5, well, shit. If we still want stuff, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. How many of those jobs do you think are going to be blue collar? All of them. So we're at the beginning of the golden age of organized labor in the United States. And to be perfectly blunt, Trump's version of the Republican Party has done a better job of catering to these people's insecurities and hopes than the Democrats have. With the Democrats, I'm a little oversimplifying here, but it's been mostly about making them into a voting machine. And that worked until 6 years ago.
Ken?
So well, first of all, apologies, Peter and Jen, for my computer was doing jujitsu to keep me off. I don't know what was going on, but it was not fun.
It was national security.
Yeah, I guess so. So I got a lot of national security questions, but I want to pick up on the one we've been talking about, the union. Sure. So it's very interesting to me that switch too. When I first saw the union guy being announced as being at the convention, I thought, I must be reading this wrong. It can't be
like, am I looking at the right convention?
I'm looking at the right convention. Is this the Democrat? But anyway, so I mean, you talked about that Trump's tent's not big enough to win the election. So I guess my question is, so it looks like the tent's expanding, because it's at least this group that I never would have, just like you probably a couple of years ago, never would have thought these guys would be part of, or could be possibly part of. So how do we square that with what we're seeing with the polls, where it seems like all the polls now, granted we could have a change.
Ignore the polls.
Yeah, I know.
Ignore any poll in the United States that comes out before the convention process is finished. That will not be until August 22.
Right.
And then ignore any poll that just looks at percentage vote, because that's not how we select our president. We go through the Electoral College. And then ignore any poll that does not include RFK Jr. because RFK Jr. is probably the most popular, well, certainly the most popular third-party candidate since at least Ross Perot. Look at those polls in September. Ignore everything until then. Keep in mind that independent voters, who are now more than 10% of the population because some of the back and forth, which includes most union voters now, never answer poll questions until after the conventions. So everything until this point is wrong. It has always been wrong. We have never had a single poll in American history that has been released before the conventions that has ever been right.
So you still think that he can't? I mean, is there a possibility? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, you think there's a possibility of his 10 expanding to the point where he has a shot?
Or I can't rule it out, and I think you've
right.
definitely put your finger on the group that is most likely to move. But there's been a lot of arguments within the union community in just the last week last 3 days, because of the Teamster president being there. Officially, at the leadership level, I'd say 95% of the unions are still very, very, very pro-Democrat. But that's not where the votes are. The votes are at the rank and file level, and it's impossible to poll that independently until we're on the backside of an election. So I agree that that's where the wiggle room is.
Okay.
Ken, I'm going to go in a different direction. If you want to ask about some national security questions before I take it in a geopolitical direction, and or if anyone else chimes in with any questions.
No, I thought that was, I really was interested the way when you put it on the diagram and you had it like square in the center, like in the bullseye, not probably a term I don't want to use right now, but it was right there in the middle. So where do you see this falling out over the next couple months, of course, of the election with that group in particular? That really is where I'm kind of curious.
It's mostly confusion. I mean, Donald Trump made it very clear near the end of his first term that if he was reelected, the first thing he would do on his second term, the first day, was leave NATO. Obviously, that would have some implications for national security issues. At the same time, there seems to be this movement that, especially J.D. Vance is headlining for, the idea that Russia's the problem, that China's the problem, but there is no China without Russia. I mean, if you want to destroy China, the easiest way to do that is to if you want to destroy China, the easiest way to do that is to kneecap Russia. That's where the energy and the raw materials come from. So there's this disconnect in national security issues on the right because they've ejected all the people who actually can find Canada on a map. And it makes it a very different sort of conversation. There's a lot of knee-jerk reactions that are completely disconnected from reality. Say what you will about Joe Biden, he was around when the Han ethnicity emerged sometime in the 3rd century AD. He remembers their rise, probably, although that's a little bit in doubt now. And so he's actually had a very conservative approach, classically conservative approach to most of the foreign policy questions. Does that make him an A-list president? No. But it does at least give him a degree of grounding that we're not seeing in the Republicans these days. And, we're normally used to seeing those two roles flipped.
Right.
So a lot of what you have discussed in your books is that people don't matter. It's the geopolitics.
That's harsh, but yes.
Right? I mean, I kind of nailed it on the head.
Yeah.
Of course, obviously sitting here about ready to, watch Donald Trump speak at the RNC, it feels very much in America like people do matter. So you were talking about there's going to be one more shift until these parties really coalesce into whatever it is they're going to look like. Do you think that it matters for that shift who becomes president in the next year?
In moments of transition like this, yes, the personalities matter because the institutions don't matter as much. One of the huge advantages of the U.S. system is there hasn't really been a debate within the United States since the Civil War on the nature of central power versus the states. And because of that, and because of our respect for elections, while you can have a change at the top where people are using different stationery, we really only have had 2 foreign policies now since the 1860s. We've had the period leading up until the World Wars and then the bipartisan consensus since then. But now that the parties themselves are shifting around, the consensus itself is breaking down. I would argue it's doing it for a number of reasons independent of politics. But at times like this, when the new consensus or the new foreign policy dyad hasn't been imagined yet, it really comes down to the decision making of the people in question. The last time we went through this, it was Truman. If we had emerged from World War II with a different president, we might not have had the Japanese alliance. We might not have had NATO. The Cold War may have taken a very different turn. And the post-Cold War environment, certainly a very different turn. We are now at one of those moments in history. And I don't care how much you love Biden or how much you love Trump, but neither of them is a Truman or a Roosevelt. These are people who are obsessed with domestic political issues. It's the culture war. It's the repositioning of the American economy. For them, foreign affairs are an edge issue at most. And while Donald Trump may be more vocal about his isolationist stance, when you look at economic issues, international economic issues, the breakdown of globalization and trade, Biden and Trump are actually the two most similar presidents we've ever had.
Well, on that note, you said something that I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You mentioned that I think I heard you say they're both populists.
Oh, yeah.
Did I hear? Okay. Can you elaborate on that? I don't think many people would consider Biden a populist in the way that they considered Trump a populist.
Biden has expanded spending for political reasons by more than any president in history except for Donald Trump. And the only reason he doesn't pass Donald Trump is his 4-year term is not up yet. If he keeps on his current pace, he's going to pass Trump around Election Day. They're both violating contracts. They're just doing it on different issues for different reasons for different constituents. Neither of them is a big defender of rule of law. Both of them are very economically liberal in the classic sense in terms of using the government to hand out political favors and economic favors to their supporters. That's populist in a nutshell.
Given all of this, what do you think that this has to do? How does this impact United States and our general sense of liberalism, classical liberalism? I mean, is this realignment of parties just going to tear these ideas apart? Is it going to realign in a new way? I mean, our ideas.
That's a great question. Historically speaking, the populists have their moment during the transition, but they're never able to consolidate into a new political force because ultimately they're cultish, they're not good at math, they don't respect the rule of law. And if you try to make a political movement out of that, all it takes is one person dying and then the whole thing falls apart. And whichever party is more responsible, if that's the right term, tends to pick up the pieces and run with it. So this definitely happened in the favor of the Republicans the last time around. It definitely happened in favor of the Democrats the time before that. But, you know, saying that that's pro-Republican or pro-Democrat is meaningless because they were both very different parties, both before and after those transitions. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that the coalition that on the Republican side has been built around rule of law, national security, strong economic growth, the business community, and then as the sidecar, social conservative values. The Democratic coalition that's been built around racial inequality and intellectualism, those two coalitions are gone. And we don't know how the factions that respect the things that you're identifying with are going to come together or not. You can imagine, I'm not saying it's going to go this way, but you can imagine an urban coalition that involves the business side of the current Republican coalition and the intellectual side of the current Democratic coalition, which would be diametrically opposed to what Trump is trying to form. That is potentially a stable mix. You can also imagine a more European coalition where the unions and the business community are in the same group. That would be potent, but it's just too early to know.
It doesn't allow this, you mentioned this at the very beginning, revolve around how we have chosen to vote. The actual, is it called first past the post, where it locks us into two parties? If there were another way to vote, like what's the
proportional representation? That's basically where you vote for a party, and if the party gets 25% of the votes, they get 25% of the seats.
Right. Is there ever a possibility? I mean, in that scenario, there would be the rise of third party groups. Sometimes that's not always good. Those can also be very extreme third party groups on both the right and the left.
I think it's great to have extremist third parties because they can never get in and they siphon off the crazies.
So why is that never a discussion about how we vote, where we could break? That would be a coalition breaker.
Well, let me give you two things here. First of all, we do get third parties in times of transition like we have right now. Basically, you have a party that splits in half or falls apart, or a new group that rises up. And in that time, you have like one political cycle, maybe two, where the three of them duke it out. But it becomes very, very clear that the two smaller ones either need to merge or find a way to drive the bigger one into pieces in order to have a chance at national power. Because it's all great to say you have a third party, but if the third party can never get into power, it falls apart pretty quickly. So, just spitballing here, don't get mad at me. If Donald Trump were to die today, the Republican Party would basically become a third party and the Democrats would probably split in half. That's just kind of where the fissure points are right now. We could get the national security conservatives, the business community, and the labor group to come together as a third party. That would be really interesting. But it's not stable. It would be one cycle, maybe two. That's it. What was the other point I had? Yeah, it's gone. Yes. Getting to that. If you want to have an institutional third, fourth, or fifth party, you have to have a constitutional change. The electoral system is core in the Constitution. We're not talking about an amendment here. We're talking about a constitutional convention, which is something this country has never had. And there's actually no guidance in the Constitution as to how you run it or how many states get what votes. So if we were to go to that stage, you're talking about everything being a free-for-all, and we have a Bolivian-style clusterfuck. No one's talking about that.
So I guess one thing I was looking at, because the third party thing's always been interesting to me, but they can, it seems like the only, at least my view of it, the only time that the two traditional parties seem to get along is when they try to keep the third party from becoming too powerful. So how does that third party get around all this? I mean, that's because I think it would introduce a new dynamic to it. I think it would be interesting, but there's no incentive on either of the two major parties to let the new guy on the block come in.
Well,
and it
there's
goes back to
three ways we've done this in the past. Number one is you have a very, very powerful personality who has enough of a personal following that they're able to draw votes from the other two. That has happened in the past with us. That's, for example, the Teddy Roosevelt play.
Right.
Ross Perot failed. Donald Trump probably would have gone that path if he hadn't been able to capture the Republican Party and make it his own. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I wouldn't say that there's anyone out there except for maybe like Oprah who could throw their hat in the ring and actually change the pattern. And she has made it very clear she is not interested. Okay, so that's one. Number two is you have a fight within the party and it splits down the middle. This is exactly where the Democrats came from. And if it were to happen today, I think it would probably happen in the Democratic Party because the Republican Party is already broken. It's already been consolidated into this new form that's very pro-Trump, and all the old school, the Reaganite Republicans have been forced into the political wilderness. And I think it's too soon to think about them as an independent entity. And then the third one is you have more of an organic, usually a regional group that rises up. And that's why I'm kind of toying with the idea of this urban party, because it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. But it does mean you basically siphon a huge amount of votes, especially away from the Democrats, in order to make that happen. Because you take the core Republican supporters of yesteryear, especially the business community and the national security community, and then you draw in what are the leading lights of the Democratic side. The challenge with getting to that this time isn't Donald Trump or Joe Biden, it's Barack Obama. Barack Obama ran on charisma, and he ran a campaign independent of the Democratic Party until he got the nomination, and then kind of Trump style hijacked the Democratic National Committee. In doing that, he basically sidelined everybody who had been in the party to that point, and for the next 8 years, he sucked all the air out of the room. And so the Republicans, even under Trump, have a bench. The Democrats don't. And so it's difficult to imagine those party stalwarts on the left having a break, because none of them matter enough that if they break, that anything changes.
Well, speaking of that, though, we've seen so much lately with what looks like, you from the outsider looking in, almost a break over whether or not President Biden should run again. I mean, you've got some big Democratic names coming out saying absolutely not.
Sure.
Is that not looking like the break that you're talking about?
It might. The question, of course, is who takes the torch. I mean, Biden, for his faults, and there's a list, has name recognition. He was vice president before, and before he became vice president, he was broadly respected on both sides of the aisle. He's the last guy. There's not a whole new raft of people chomping at the bit to get into it. So if Biden were to withdraw, which me personally I think would be a great plan, the question is who throws their hats in the ring. Now, I have been reading a lot in the last 2 hours about how the scuttlebutt in DC is that Biden has already made the decision to withdraw, and by the time this goes live on YouTube, it'll already all be over. We'll see. But if that happens, it depends upon who throws their hat in the ring. The scuttlebutt, to which I have not had a chance to dive in to see if it's true, is that Harris would obviously throw her hat in the ring. Joe Biden would not endorse anyone until the convention concluded. And in the first round of voting, the Democrats' superdelegates would not be allowed to vote. If that is true, we might get an open, honest contest among the Democrats about who's next. From a structural point of view, that would be great. It would also mean there would be a huge disincentive for the complete wackadoos to throw their hats in the ring. You wouldn't see Elizabeth Sanders. You wouldn't see Bernie Sanders. You wouldn't see Elizabeth Warren. You wouldn't see anyone from the squad. You'd probably see a bunch of governors. The way our political evolution has happened the last 12 years with campaign finance, we've basically made it very, very difficult for people with any sort of track record to run, because anyone can go and find something they don't like and then just blow it out of proportion. And so we've gotten a lot of ideologues. That's Barack Obama. That's Donald Trump. Governors, as a rule, make much better presidents because they actually have to deal with people, especially people that don't like them, and still make the trains run on time. And so if the Democrats were to have that sort of convention where governors would actually feel an incentive, we could get a really strong candidate out of them. But, this is an if based on an if based on an if based on an old guy deciding he's done.
Maybe you should make a call.
Yeah, my contacts don't go that high.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting dynamic if it plays out. I guess you've already heard some of the key leaders in congressional blocks, I think, have said already, if it's not Harris, then there's going to be a significant pullout of support for whoever else is coming on board.
Well, it depends on who it is. We just don't know. I mean, I would argue that any Democratic governor would make a solid candidate for moderate voters. That's the whole point of having an open convention this late in the process, is all the wackadoos who want crazy candidates don't control the process. That would be a step forward no matter which party it was.
Yeah, I just another question, because one of the groups that you called out I thought was very, very interesting, and kind of trying to figure out where they land was the law and order group. So, given what you said, both parties have been kind of loosey goosey with the legal aspects of what they do. Where do you see these guys in this current cycle eventually falling out? No idea.
It's like at the moment, the menu for that group is awful. So, you're going to have folks like, I don't know, Border Patrol and INS, who are obviously like Trump for a number of reasons. Right. But you're going to have all the people in the financial sector doing regulations, which are a much larger group physically, who are completely in the mix. Folks in law enforcement have discovered in the last few years that they've gone from very much on the right, being concerned about groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, to all of a sudden finding themselves having to deal with weapons and white people. And it's like just the security environment in this country has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And they're confused and a little scared, and I totally get it.
So I know this is probably on a lot of people's mind. You kind of touched already on the assassination attempt of Trump.
Did I?
And I've seen you did just a tad.
Okay.
And by the way, for those watching, if you want to get Peter's newsletters, you can sign up at Zeihan.com, Zeihan. Peter, I feel that perhaps this attempt, and you might have swayed some people towards the Trump side. Is that?
I swayed them how?
No, not you. The
Oh, okay.
attempt
Oh, got
itself
it. Got it. Maybe
may
voters.
have.
It's
We're talking when
possible.
we're talking about big tents, and is there the potential for the Republican Party to consolidate over something?
Yeah.
Is this something that they could consolidate over? And this kind of touches on the law and order side of
I mean,
things.
everything is in flux, so I don't want to rule anything out, but I have to go with a firm I don't know because this has never happened in American politics before. We've never had somebody who was obviously going to get the nomination, who was the target of an assassination attempt and survived. Obviously, if Trump had died, it would be really easy to forecast his political future. That's a cop-out, of course. But the last guy who got the nomination was shot was Teddy Roosevelt, who finished his speech after getting shot and went on to lead his party to one of the 5 greatest electoral defeats in American history. So we have one past example of how this might go. And I would caution you to say this is going to go one way or the other because of this incident, because most of the people who are talking about this is obviously going to help Trump are speaking at the RNC right now. We are having the Republican palooza right now. So of course they're going to say anything that talks up their candidate. And by the time we get to August 19, assuming that Biden is still going to be the candidate, he's going to be talking about how he went toe to toe with COVID and won. And everyone's going to be like, yeah, he beat COVID. You know, it's like, this is just the par for the course when it comes to politics.
I've got a question about the Republican Party.
Which, you know, is 180 billion years old. You might not.
Aren't they both about that same age?
Pretty close. They're less than 2 years apart. So if Trump, I mean, obviously, if Biden wins, he'll be the oldest president ever. But if Donald Trump wins, he will be the oldest president on the first day of his term as well. Yeah. Neither of these guys are with it.
Well, you talking about the Republican Party and that it's in flux and it's kind of figuring out its coalitions. You know, it's interesting though, because you have seen all these people, these never Trumpers, for example, his new vice president, JD Vance, people like Nikki Haley, people like DeSantis.
That was awkward. Nikki Haley, she looked like she was giving a toast to her ex-husband who cheated on her with the secretary at his next wedding. It's like she didn't want to be there. Trump didn't want her there. It was really awkward.
But this is what you're seeing. So you're seeing Trump. We've seen how the business, the national security, law and order, unions, they're all kind of all in the wilderness, as you will. But he's been able, because he's remade the party as the Donald Trump party, if I heard you correctly, he's been able though to pull in these people who were never Trumpers, the JD Vances, the Nikki Haley's, the DeSantis. So why wouldn't he be able to pull in, in the same way, the communities that you say are now in the political wilderness?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, voting is a binary decision in the United States in most races. So do you vote for the red or do you vote for the blue? And everyone is going to have to go into that ballot box and think through what matters most to them. But they also have to show up.
Right.
And even months after Nikki Haley withdrew from the race, she was still polling 20 to 30% in the primaries. To think that 20 to 30% of Republicans that preferred her are going to still show up is a bit of a stretch. And one of the reasons why I still see this as Biden's race to lose is the Republicans have won every race that the Republicans have won. They've won because they've been unified. There are fewer Republicans than there are Democrats. So it's all based on turnout for them. And if they can't guarantee all of their factions show, it's going to hurt. Nikki Haley is reflective of that.
And so as it stands right now, right this minute, as the coalitions are in flux, I mean, is the Republican Party, it looks like, from what I'm hearing you say, it is the Trump party is the Republican Party.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt there at all.
That's how it's been remade at the moment.
Yeah, whether it's stable or not. I mean, Trump's 79. The torch is going to have to be passed at some point. And yeah, I guess JD Vance is as good as any. But no one out there has his kind of grip on the imagination of the populists.
no one out there has the same kind of grip as Trump on the imagination of the
Right.
public.
And so when Trump is gone, and he even if he's a Castro and he's around for a while, this isn't a stable long-term coalition.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess flipping the switch now to look at the other side. So
Sure.
what do you see? What is going to motivate, other than Trump, or the Democratic side to get out and vote if their choices are?
Oh yeah. Nobody on the left is like, go Biden. Let's be clear.
Yeah,
here.
exactly. So who do you see, or is there anybody there that's going to? I mean, I really same way. I don't see it for Biden. I'm not sure I see it for Harris either. I don't know, but who? Is there something that's going to unify them other than just being against something?
The single biggest motivator, if you're on the left, is absolutely Donald Trump, and people will show up to vote against him, whoever happens to be on the other side. Also, keep in mind that one of the things that we saw in the midterms, everyone's forgotten about the midterms. We had the independents vote against any Trump-anointed candidate by massive margins, 4-1 in some cases. Republicans have never, ever captured the presidency without capturing at least 2/3 of the independents. Remember, there's fewer Republicans than Democrats. They need those independent votes. And Donald Trump has told the independents that their vote doesn't matter, that it should all be decided at the primary level. Well, that wasn't very smart. So on the left, they don't need coherence. That has been something that it's been the Republicans that need. Now, that's for this electoral cycle. The Democrats are as disorganized as ever, and with the probable loss of the unions, they really need to figure out another plan, or they're going to have a flip with the Republicans in that they will have fewer voters. Also, keep in mind that Donald Trump, for all of his faults, and yes, there's a list, garnered a greater percentage of African American and Hispanic voters than any Republican president of the last 60 years. That is not a rounding error. Despite all of his flaws, in bits and pieces, some of that big tent feeling is starting to happen a little bit. He's not to the majority of either of those communities, but it is enough to spook the Democrats, and it should. And the way you get around this is by building a new factional coalition or having a very strong personality at the top. And in that, the Democrats are far behind the Republicans. So this might work for them this round. After that, sky's the limit for both sides.
So before we let you go, what about just giving us an overall, accidental superpower, end of the world is just the beginning, 30,000-foot view of where you see America, these politics aside, in the next 5 to 10 years?
The biggest issue that the United States has to wrestle, well, two issues that the U.S. has to wrestle with in the next decade, regardless of who is the president. Number one, as the Chinese system breaks up due to demographic dissolution, if we still want stuff, we have to build it ourselves. So we need to have an industrial policy that allows us to very, very rapidly build out the industrial plant and our electrical grid. It doesn't matter to me who's president for that, because as long as the parties are dysfunctional, we're not going to have a good coordination for that at the national level. This is a states issue. And honestly, I would much rather have it be a states issue because they're closer to the people. We get 50 different policy experiments. We get a good idea of what works and what doesn't work. The problem with that approach is it's slower and we are in a very limited time frame. The second big challenge is relations with Mexico, because there is nothing in the American manufacturing system that works today without some Mexican involvement. And if we're going to lose the low-end productive capacity, low-end quality productive capacity of China, then Mexico is our best friend in replacing that in North America. And if relations between the United States and Mexico fall apart, and we have to do this on our own, we're looking at a catastrophic loss in economic vitality and in the standard of living of the average American. And if you think that'll go down without massive political consequences, you need to read your history again.
So what do you, on both of those notes, A, do we have the capacity? And I think part of the answer is,
can we pull it off? No. Yes.
Okay. Well, the way I understood that we could pull it off was by using a lot of the maquiladores. Is that?
Oh, that's last Thursday.
Was that last Thursday?
I don't mean to suggest that the doors don't exist. They do, but most of them have really gone upscale. I'd argue that most of the border communities on the Mexican-U.S. border now actually have a higher value add per per cost unit than Canadian manufacturers. They've really come a long way in the last 30 years. And if you compare the cost of the material or the low-end components that go into Mexico versus the stuff that comes out, it's arguably the highest value-add economy in the world right now.
So using Mexico as that base is kind of
not
off the
necessarily
table?
a base, but certainly a partner. The United States is really good at the high end. We're really good at the design. Mexico is really good at the mid quality. They're really good at the assembly. And you combine those two, you get the most powerful economy in the world by like a factor of 3. You break them apart, and neither of them work well.
Okay, so then that leads to the second question. Where are we with Mexico?
Well, we're about to get a new president in Mexico, which is great because the last one was a moron. Whether the new one is going to be sufficiently independent from the old guy remains to be seen. I'm sorry, let me use names. AMLO is the old guy. He basically combined the worst attributes of Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and J.D. Vance, and Ted Cruz.
That's quite a feat.
An incompetent asshole, driven by ideology, regardless of what actually was happening in the world. Unfortunately, Sheinbaum, the incoming president, is his protege, so we don't know how independent she will be. We will find out very soon. I haven't written it off yet, but it is probably my single largest concern today is the nature of that relationship, far more important in my view than anything that happens in Washington with the election.
Do you think one of our presidents over the other will be best for that relationship?
It's kind of hard to tell. Donald Trump was an atypical president for the Mexican relationship in that he had a one-on-one relationship with AMLO that was actually reasonably productive. He basically told AMLO, if you become the real wall in blocking Central American migrants to the United States, I will let you have your way on everything else. Water rights, security issues, the drug war. I don't care what anything else is. You just deal with that one issue. And with that sort of backdrop, the trade relationship was fine. Joe Biden is a much more traditional president in that there's all these issues in the bilateral relationship as a neighbor that we have to talk about. And AMLO, being the asshat that he was, took that as a personal affront. So if AMLO was still the president, I could tell you how it would probably go down, but AMLO isn't the president. So it really is new. Keep in mind that Mexico's really only been a real democracy for like 4 election cycles here. So they're making this up as they go along, just like we are with our political system.
Well, it's good to know that chaos is not limited to us here in the U.S.
Yeah, no, it's there are a lot of elections this year, and a lot of them really matter, and a lot of them have gone batshit.
That's a very optimistic tune.
Well, it's like one of the beautiful things about globalization is the U.S. kind of held the lid on everything and made everything stable in places that normally wouldn't be. Now that the United States is stepping back from that role, the lid is coming off, and what happens in everyone's individual backyard all of a sudden matters a lot more.
And just to repeat what you said with regards to globalization is Trump or Biden, we're going to see these globalized trends continue. Like neither is really going to have that big of an impact on, or both are going to be more isolationist in their policies.
Absolutely. When it comes to economic issues, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the business community really, really hated Trump for like basically shutting down the World Trade Organization and stopping all trade negotiations. Biden hasn't picked up any of that stuff. In fact, every single tariff that Donald Trump put on, Biden hasn't only continued with, he's institutionalized into U.S. policy.
And we don't have enough time, but for anyone interested in these geopolitical trends, your books, The Accidental Superpower, Absent Superpower, your newest book, all kind of give us an idea of why these trends are in place right now and where America is becoming more isolationist and why. So we'll leave that for reading. Ken, any final questions from you?
I do. It's on NATO. So I mean, I think just
Sure.
Just a quick one as we kind of leave, since it's kind of near and dear to my heart, having spent 11 years working over there with them. So where do you see this going? I mean, you say, if Trump comes in, he's made these comments. He made them before. It didn't happen. What do you see? Let's say Trump wins it, where do you see NATO, the alliance, going if he does?
I mean, here's the problem with predicting what Donald Trump is going to do. Number one, he's not a builder, he's a breaker. And so it's very easy for the president to take a treaty, to take an association, to take a relationship and end it. There's a lot of executive authority in that, and Trump proved that. It's much more difficult for a president to come in and build something. And that requires a degree of attention that Donald Trump has never demonstrated. So the idea that Trump would come in and NATO would become stronger because of it, no. The idea that Donald Trump could come in and very quickly just end American participation in the alliance, very, very, very feasible. The second problem with predicting Trump, it's whoever flattered him most recently who gets their way. And the problem we saw in his first term is he brought in a lot of people in the national security community who really knew what they were doing, but they were willing to speak truth to power. So they were never the last person to flatter Donald Trump. He fired them. He went with the Russians and the Chinese. That's problematic from a national security point of view, to say the least.
So not optimistic would be
not optimistic. No. Now, believe it or not, let's see, where is it? In this book, I talk about the United States being out of NATO. So it's like, I've always seen this coming, but we have a hot war with the nuclear power going on right now. And if this is the moment that the U.S. steps back, we are picking a really big fight for us in the long term. If we can hold on for another 4 years, and I'm not saying that because that's the presidential term, that's how long the Russians can maintain their current tempo. It's a different conversation. If the U.S. withdraws from Europe while Russia is intact and on the warpath, that's one thing. If the U.S. withdraws from Europe when Russia is broken and on the other side of their demographic bomb, that's another.
And that demographic bomb you're saying is also 4 years, approximately.
I would argue that the Russians are going to have some serious problems maintaining a front of any form in about 4 years. And if you go forward 8 years, their capacity for having a mass military is gone. They will basically run out of men in their 20s. So we are in that period, just like with everything else, where actually the personality matters. Damn it.
And with that, we will leave everyone. Thank you for joining us to go and see what happens next in our American political transition. Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Peter. Very good.